I've spent the past several weeks buried in after-action reports, veteran testimonials, and military medicine journals, chasing a story I stumbled onto almost by accident. I was reading through a first-person account on the New Zealand government's own Vietnam War archive, a medic talking about morphine and dust-offs. And one sentence stopped me completely. He mentioned his pre-deployment training, and the way he described it didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard associated with a military unit preparing for war. He said it was magnificent. That word, in that context, from a man who went on to describe claymore wounds and watching men turn gray, nagged at me for days. I kept digging. And the deeper I went, the more a picture emerged of two radically different philosophies about what a battlefield medic needed to know before the helicopter came down, before the bullets started flying, before the blood started pooling in the mud of Phuoc Tuy province. What I found wasn't just a training gap, it was a chasm, and understanding it changes how you read every casualty report from that war. August 18th, 1966. A rubber plantation east of Nui Dat, South Vietnam. I want you to imagine the medic's position. D Company 6RAR has just walked into one of the worst ambushes of the entire Australian involvement in Vietnam. 108 men against an estimated 2,500 enemy. The radio crackles. The rain hammers down so hard you can barely see the man next to you. And somewhere in that noise and chaos and blood, the men who fall are going to live or die based on one thing: the hands of the man assigned to keep them alive. When I first came across the casualty figures from Long Tan, I ran them twice because I didn't believe them. 17 Australians killed, 25 wounded, against an enemy force that outnumbered them more than 20-1. The wounded who survived that afternoon needed immediate, skilled trauma care in conditions that would have broken most medical professionals. No surgical suite, no proper lighting, monsoon rain, rounds still flying, darkness falling. They got it. They survived. What I found when I dug further into how the Australians and New Zealanders prepared their medics for exactly that moment versus how the United States Army was processing theirs in the same period stopped me cold. The contrast was not subtle. It was not a matter of minor doctrinal differences or budget variations. It was, fundamentally, the difference between a medic who had spent weeks working real trauma cases in a functioning civilian emergency department and a medic who had spent 8 weeks at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio being taught, among other things, how to make a hospital bed properly. This is that story. When the United States began its massive military buildup in Vietnam in 1965, the medical establishment faced a demand problem unlike any it had encountered before. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers needed to be trained, equipped, and deployed. Tens of thousands of medics needed to be produced. The system that existed, the Army Medical Department's training pipeline at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, became the funnel through which virtually every combat medic 91A would pass before being handed a unit assignment and orders for Southeast Asia. The logic seemed sound at the time. Fort Sam was a proven facility. It had Brooke Army Hospital on site. It had instructors. It had structure. And in the context of a military that was scaling with unprecedented speed to meet the demands of an increasingly unpopular war, it produced bodies. 10,000 Army medics and Navy corpsmen would serve in Vietnam over the course of the conflict. The pipeline had to work. There was no time for anything else. Reading through accounts of that training, the picture is consistent. It was approximately 8 weeks. Half was hospital orderly work, administering medication, working IVs, learning catheter procedures, changing bedpans, making beds. The other half was focused on combat trauma, wounds to the head, body, and extremities, stopping bleeding, keeping airways open, preventing shock. Students practiced IV insertion on each other. They were taught the basics. One medic who went through Fort Sam in January 1967, writing later about his time in country, captured the prevailing attitude with a sentence that stayed with me. He described medic training as interesting and satisfying, said the classes were difficult and demanding. He was relieved the training wasn't worse. And then, 8 weeks after he arrived, he had orders. That was it. From a distance, in 1965 or 1966, this looked like a functional system. The medics were learning. They were being certified. They were going to serve alongside the best-equipped military in the history of the world, with helicopter evacuation assets that could get a man from a rice paddy to a surgical table in under an hour. What more could be needed? Reading these reports now, knowing what was actually happening in the Australian and New Zealand preparation pipeline at the same time, I kept thinking the same thing over and over. These men were being sent in underprepared, not through any malice or negligence, but through the sheer arithmetic of scale. The U.S. Army needed medics by the thousands. And thousands of medics by necessity meant a product that was shaped more by volume than by clinical depth. To understand why Australia and New Zealand approached medic preparation differently, you have to go back before Vietnam. You have to go to the rubber estates and river valleys of Malaya. The Malayan emergency, which ran from 1948 to 1960, became the doctrinal crucible for almost everything the Australian Army would do well in Vietnam. In Malaya, Australian and British Commonwealth forces learned to fight small, to fight smart and critically, to sustain their men in conditions where medical evacuation was slow, unreliable, and often impossible. A wounded man in the deep jungle of the Malay Peninsula was going to be cared for by whoever was with him, with whatever was in the patrol's med kit, for however long it took to get him out. That reality shaped everything. It forced a philosophy of preemptive clinical competence rather than reactive stabilization. A medic needed to be able to do more, because for long stretches of time, the medic was all there was. By the time Australian and New Zealand units began deploying to Vietnam in the early to mid-1960s, this philosophy had embedded itself into how the ANZAC military establishment thought about medical preparation. It was not yet perfect. The JMVH, the Journal of Military and Veterans Health, would later document that even Australia's training programs during the Vietnam buildup suffered from significant deficiencies, noting that training consisted of too much advanced theory without basis to build up practical knowledge and no casualty training, resulting in some medics arriving in country who still needed supplemental field preparation. The Australians were not immune to the problems of scaling. But there was a crucial distinction in the New Zealand approach, in particular, that set it apart from anything the U.S. system was doing. Where Fort Sam Houston built its curriculum around military-specific scenarios and hospital orderly work, New Zealand was doing something that sounds almost startlingly obvious in retrospect, and yet apparently wasn't obvious to anyone designing a mass-production medic pipeline under wartime pressure. They sent their medics to work in real hospitals. The NZ medic, whose account I found on the New Zealand government's own Vietnam War archive, had served as the company medic for W3. He described his training with a single word I mentioned at the start of this research: magnificent. And then he explained why. "We received magnificent training in New Zealand," he wrote, "that included working at Christchurch Hospital A&E. We got good practice in suturing, minor surgery, and dealing with trauma. Christchurch Hospital, accident and emergency, real patients, real trauma, real bleeding, real decisions made in real time with incomplete information and imperfect conditions." That medic arrived in Vietnam having already sutured wounds, having already seen what trauma looked like before the cleanliness of a surgical suite, having already made the kind of fast, hands-under-pressure decisions that cannot be replicated in a classroom or taught through diagrams of wound categories. The first Australian field hospital, established at Vung Tau in April 1968, brought this philosophy to an institutional level. Australian nursing staff, many recruited directly from civilian hospitals, arrived with experience that extended beyond the military-specific curriculum of Fort Sam Houston. The 2nd Field Ambulance, which had been operating since 1966, included surgical staff who, as the Australian War Memorial records document, had accumulated genuine clinical depth before they ever set foot in South Vietnam. The unit treated not only Australian casualties, but American and New Zealand wounded, and was, by the accounts that survive, regarded well beyond the boundaries of its own national contingent. The New Zealand civilian surgical team that preceded military deployments entirely arrived in Quy Nhon in April 1963, on ANZAC Day, as it happened, 2 years before New Zealand combat troops set foot in country. They were treating war casualties, training Vietnamese medical staff, managing bubonic plague and typhoid alongside gunshot wounds, building institutional knowledge of tropical combat medicine before any of their nation's soldiers had fired a shot in anger. By the time NZ military medics deployed alongside the 1st Australian Task Force, there was already a foundation of practical knowledge that no 8-week military training pipeline could replicate. May 1969. Long Sun Island, Rung Sat Special Zone. I want to return to the NZ medic whose account started me on this research. He's with Company HQ. The mortar section is with him. Around lunchtime, a group of Viet Cong attack from behind an earthen bund across a dry paddy field. An RPG round hits the crown of a palm tree directly above his head and showers him with shredded vegetation. An M16 and what sounds like an AK-47 open up. He can hear rounds kicking up sand, cracking overhead. And then he hears someone calling for a medic from a gun pit on the far edge of the paddy, across 25 meters of completely open ground with no cover, directly toward the enemy. He ran. What I found when I dug into his account wasn't the moment of action that stopped me. Vietnam medics on both sides regularly performed acts of extraordinary physical courage that should never be minimized. What stopped me was what happened when he got there. He arrived at a pit packed with tangled wounded men, assessed the situation, administered morphine, established IVs, applied bandages, managed airways, and organized the dust-off under fire. He did it fast. He did it correctly. He did it with the clinical competence of someone who had already seen what trauma looks like and had already made those decisions before, in a real emergency department, before any of this started. Contrast that with what the JMVH documented was happening at the unit level for medics who had come through less preparation. Men arriving in Vietnam who had to be, in the journal's own words, trained up in emergency and evacuation medicine in the field before they could adequately support the Allied forces. Not trained before they arrived. Trained after, in country, under operational conditions, while their units were already in the field. There is no polite way to say what that means. It means that in the critical early months of a medic's tour, the months when they were most likely to encounter casualties, when their skills were being formed under pressure, some of the men depending on them were effectively paying the tuition. This wasn't universal. The U.S. system produced many exceptional medics, men of courage, ingenuity, and genuine skill who overcame the limitations of their preparation through sheer force of character and on-the-job adaptation. The Special Forces medic pipeline was genuinely rigorous. And the DUSTOFF program, the helicopter medevac system that flew under fire to reach the wounded, was a genuinely revolutionary contribution to combat casualty survival that has no parallel in any other nation's involvement in that war. But the Green Berets represented a small fraction of the medics in Vietnam. The 10,000 Army medics and Navy corpsmen who served in that war were overwhelmingly products of the 8-week Fort Sam pipeline. And against the documented ANZAC and Australian approaches, that pipeline's limitations are impossible to ignore. September 1967. Phuoc Tuy Province. 2 field ambulances receiving casualties from a contact near Nui Dat. The surgical team includes personnel who had worked civilian emergency and surgical departments before deployment. The triage moves efficiently. The Australian War Memorial notes that by this period the unit was regarded by the Allied medical community in-country as a high-standard facility, one that American casualties were brought to, not just Australian ones. That last fact is worth sitting with. American wounded were being taken to an Australian field hospital by American commanders, not as a last resort, not as a matter of geographic convenience, but because of the recognized quality of care available there. I spent a week trying to find a comparable example going the other direction. Australian wounded being specifically directed to U.S. facilities because of superior clinical standards. I did not find one. The Battle for Long Tan in August 1966 provides perhaps the most dramatic statistical case study in the entire Australian involvement. 108 men against an estimated 2,500 enemy. 17 killed, 25 wounded. The survival of that wounded contingent, in darkness, in monsoon rain, at the far edge of what was a comprehensive tactical emergency, depended entirely on the immediate care delivered by medics before any surgical team could reach them. That 25 men were wounded and 25 men survived to reach a surgical facility is a testament in part to preparation, to what happened at Christchurch Hospital A&E and at facilities like it before a single man boarded a plane for South Vietnam. The U.S. Army was not blind to what its training pipeline was producing. Even within the 8-week Fort Sam curriculum, there were constant internal debates about the balance between volume and quality. And by the mid to late years of the conflict, those debates were producing tangible changes. Reading through the Army's own medical history documentation from the period, you can track the growing institutional awareness that what worked for training medics at the scale and speed demanded by Vietnam's buildup was not necessarily producing the clinical competence the battlefield required. Colonel Frederick Timmerman, the deputy commander of the 44th Medical Brigade, noted with some frustration that most medical corps officers in Vietnam had essentially no military training and, as a result of their years of clinical experience, thought of themselves as specialists first. The irony was painful. The officers who had the most clinical depth were often those least adapted to military medical operations, while the enlisted medics who were most adapted to military operations often had the least clinical depth. The Army's response evolved, slowly, across the course of the conflict. Special Forces medic training at Fort Bragg was always more rigorous and always incorporated more genuine clinical exposure. By the later years of the war, there were increased efforts to attach combat medics to civilian hospitals in the United States before deployment, to give them at least some exposure to actual trauma. The system was trying to move itself toward what the ANZAC approach had institutionalized from the beginning. On the Australian side, the evolution went in a different direction. The JMVH documentation of training deficiencies, too much theory, not enough practical casualty work, prompted a systematic overhaul of the Australian military medic curriculum that extended beyond Vietnam and shaped the RAAMC's approach through subsequent decades. The lesson Australia drew from its own training gaps in Vietnam was that civilian clinical placement wasn't enough as a supplemental element. It needed to be structural, consistent, and compulsory. The New Zealand system, whose individual account evidence suggests the civilian hospital placement philosophy was already more firmly embedded than in Australia proper, saw its approach validated by what its medics demonstrated in the field. The NZ Services medical team at Bong Sun Impact Hospital treated an estimated 46,000 outpatients annually. The breadth and quality of care documented there. Managing gunshot wounds, bubonic plague, typhoid, complex trauma, and surgical cases simultaneously reflected the clinical preparation its personnel had received before they arrived. The Vietnamese also noticed the differences. The NZ civilian surgical team's mandate from the start had been not just to treat Vietnamese casualties, but to train Vietnamese medical staff. That training relationship, experienced clinicians teaching from a foundation of real emergency department and hospital practice, produced outcomes that American MedCap teams operating from a different baseline of preparation could not always match at the individual skill level, even when the American program was better resourced. The doctrinal divergence went deeper than training methods. The Commonwealth approach carried within it a different assumption about what a medic was. In the ANZAC model, a medic was a clinician who happened to be a soldier. In the U.S. model, scaling demands had effectively produced a soldier who happened to have some medical training. Both frameworks could produce effective operators. Only one reliably produced effective clinicians. By 1968 and 1969, at the height of the Australian commitment, the first Australian task force was operating a medical system in Phuoc Tuy province that reflected the cumulative product of everything I've traced through this research. The first Australian field hospital at Vung Tau had established itself as one of the most capable field medical facilities in country. It served Australian, American, New Zealand, and Vietnamese patients. Its nursing staff included women recruited from civilian hospital backgrounds and adapted to military conditions with the kind of flexibility that comes from having treated real patients under real pressure before the war. The Australian casualty figures from the most intense period of fighting tell a specific story. Of the approximately 60,000 Australians who served in Vietnam, 521 died as a result of the war. Of the battle casualties specifically, the wounded, 2,348 were recorded, set against 414 killed in battle. That produces a wounded-to-killed ratio of approximately 5.7 to 1. What that number represents, in human terms, is the proportion of men who were hit and lived versus men who were hit and died. A higher ratio means more wounded men surviving. And that ratio is a function of multiple things: the nature of the engagements, the enemy weapons used, the speed of evacuation. But underpinning all of it is the quality of immediate care, the care delivered in the first minutes by the man with the medical kit, before any evacuation was possible. The American equivalent figures, calculated using hospitalized wounded against battle deaths, produce a ratio closer to 2.6 to 1. That gap reflects, in part, the scale disparity. The U.S. was fighting a vastly different war at vastly greater scale across multiple environments simultaneously. But it also reflects something about what happened in those critical first minutes after a man was hit, before the dust-off arrived. What changed in how people understood this in the final years of the war was the growing American recognition that the dust-off program alone could not compensate for gaps in immediate care. The helicopter was extraordinary. It could get a man to a surgical table in under an hour. But it could not stop a man bleeding out in the first 10 minutes before it arrived. That gap, the golden 10 minutes, the period before evacuation was possible, was precisely where the quality of the individual medic's preparation mattered most. And it was precisely the period for which a civilian emergency department placement, even 2 or 3 rotations through a real trauma ward, provided something that 8 weeks at Fort Sam, with its clean beds and catheter practice and theoretical wound diagrams, could not. The NZ medic who trained at Christchurch Hospital A&E summed up what that preparation and its limits felt like when the real thing finally arrived. Nothing prepared me for the trauma caused by the 7.62 rounds fired from SLRs, or the devastation that a claymore could inflict on the human body. Nothing. And yet, he ran across that open paddy field. He dove into that gun pit, and the men he treated survived to reach the dust-off. Because magnificent training is still not the same as combat, but it is the best possible thing you can give a man before combat asks everything of him. The story of ANZAC medic preparation in Vietnam didn't end with the war. It became a template. The deficiencies the JMVH literature documented, training too theoretical, not enough practical, no casualty simulation, prompted a fundamental restructuring of how Australia trained its medical personnel for combat. That restructuring incorporated the civilian hospital clinical placement philosophy that the NZ approach had demonstrated. The RAAMC evolved toward a model where military medics moved between defense facilities and civilian hospitals as a structural feature of their development, not as an exception or a privilege for the well-connected. By Iraq and Afghanistan, the difference was measurable in ways the Vietnam-era statistics can only approximate. Survivability of the injured in Vietnam was approximately 84%. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it reached 90%. Multiple factors drove that improvement. Better body armor, faster surgical response, improved tourniquets, and the tactical combat casualty care guidelines that restructured the entire pre-hospital chain. But those TCCC guidelines were not built in a vacuum. They were built on lessons learned from conflicts where the gap between prepared and underprepared medics had been measured in human lives. And Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and the US all adopted those guidelines, acknowledging what Vietnam had demonstrated. That the first 5 minutes of care determine more outcomes than any intervention that comes after. Post-war reflections from U.S. veterans who were wounded in Vietnam carry, in many cases, a specific kind of gratitude for individual medics who performed beyond what their training strictly required. Men who intuited their way through complex trauma cases through courage and intelligence rather than clinical preparation. Those men are extraordinary. But extrapolating from the extraordinary to inform system design is the error the U.S. Army made in its initial Vietnam-era pipeline. The ANZAC approach started from the premise that clinical competence was a prerequisite, not a bonus, and built its preparation accordingly. I started this research with a single word from a New Zealand medic, magnificent, describing training that included time in a real emergency department. I ended it convinced that word is one of the most consequential in the entire documentary record of ANZAC participation in the Vietnam War. Not because it describes something glorious, but because it describes something methodical, deliberate, rooted in the hard-won Malayan emergency understanding that a medic who has already seen trauma handled correctly is not the same thing as a medic who has only been told about it. The men of D Company who survived Long Tan needed both kinds of luck. The luck of artillery arriving in time, and the luck of medics who knew what to do when the firing stopped and the real work started. In Phuoc Tuy province, in 1966, they had both. The training that produced the second kind of luck didn't happen in a jungle. It happened in a hospital, under fluorescent lights, before any of this began.